Hi, and welcome to Series 3 of the Pen to Publish podcasts with your hosts, Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher, and
Alexa Tewkesbury, author, editor, and proofreader.
Hi, and welcome to Episode 3, Typefaces Part 2. Now, we're on the third episode of the Pen to Publish podcast, and we're one away from halfway. Where has the time gone? I know I always say this, Alexa, but where has the time gone?
I do think we do say this pretty much every episode, because you start recording and thinking, oh, we've got so many of these to do. And then in a flash, it's like, oh, well, that was quick.
I know.
I hope all you listeners out there are getting a load out of it.
Right, exactly. So today we're going to be looking at the minutiae detail of typefaces and the two main styles that are in use. Last week, we looked at what term typeface meant, and in this episode, I'm going to be explaining the differences between the two styles that are available. Now, I've no doubt you've heard of the fonts like bold and italic, which is what I explained last week, but have you heard of the terms serif and sans serif? Well, these are the two styles of typefaces you can have, and it refers to the small marks that are found or not found on the ends of the letters. Obviously, it's quite difficult to explain by words only, which is why in this week's show notes, there are examples of both. But let's just say that the more old-fashioned typefaces, the ones that the Romans carved in stone, are the serif ones, and the more modern styles, used a lot on web pages, are sans serif.
Now, see, with the Romans carving, if they'd used the sans serif, it would have saved them so much time without doing the wiggly bits. That's just true. Occurred to me.
I don't know whether or not they had to use, because when you're carving in stone, in order for the stone not to break, did you have to do a little tap, tap, tap beforehand to sort of build the stone up to being, I don't know. There must be a reason.
No, I've never done it.
Now, why do you need to know this? Well, it's all to do with legibility, how our eyes have been trained to read letters. Interestingly, on print, we tend to favour the serif typefaces, whereas on screen, like a web page, we can read the sans serif typeface a lot more easily.
See, that's so interesting to me. And I wonder if it's to do with the glare on the screen that takes away from the clarity of the serif typefaces in a way that doesn't happen on the page. But does that apply to Kindle? Because if a book is set in print, I think generally it would be maybe Times New Roman. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And so then presumably it's not reset for Kindle, but then maybe Kindle doesn't have the same glare as a screen, a computer screen.
I think what it's to do with is the fact that obviously on a web page, you're looking at the resolution of the image at only 72 dpi, which is very, very small. So the resolution of a serif font actually looks slightly blurry, which makes it harder. Whereas on a Kindle, you're looking at a higher resolution.
Right.
So all the Kindles that I read, they are in a serif typeface. And because the Kindle is set up with a different type of back screen light, like you said, that all helps. Whereas when you're on a screen on a computer, web pages are only at 72 dpi, so the resolution is much lower, which is why I think the sans serif typeface is much easier to read.
Right. I had no idea of any of that.
Well, there you go. So there is a bit of a disclaimer here, and that is for people who suffer with dyslexia. I mentioned this in last week's episode, and they find that the serifs on the letters, which are these little curly cues, they actually make it much harder for them to read. They much prefer a sans serif typeface, which is why dyslexia, typeface created especially for dyslexia sufferers, has no little curly cues at the end of the strokes. Now, if you go to the show notes, you'll see what I mean by that. And actually, the letters have been created with a heavier bottom. So, like if you take a T, for example, on the dyslexia font, the bottom circular part of the T is much thicker than the strike up of the T. And it helps to anchor the letters on the page, because a lot of dyslexics find that when they come to reading, the letters are floating all over.
Gosh, that must be awful. Yeah, I don't know an awful lot about dyslexia, but just going back to what you said about which typeface works best on screen, I've heard a lot of people say they find checking errors much easier when they can read on hard copies. So that's what you're saying then, that's the resolution. And when I first began editing and proofreading, because this is how old I am, although we did have electric lights, not candles, but this was way back when I first started. Every job I received used to be on hard copies. So I'd get it sent to me through the post, and then I'd have to package it all up and send it back. And I had to mark it all up with a pen. And then when I started to switch to working on screen, I did find it was quite an adjustment. And it was almost as if I didn't trust my eyes, but maybe because I'd heard people say it's easier to miss things on screen. And now I much prefer it for so many reasons, not least because I can make the text size really big, which is perfect for my bat eyes. But that makes so much sense, what you're saying about the resolution. And I suppose that's why your eyes get more tired reading on screen than reading print.
But Alexa, it's really interesting because, and we've just done a submission request for someone who is sending her manuscript to an agent. And one of their requests is that we make sure that the submission is in either Courier or Times New Roman, which is all a serif font. Now, what the agent will do, if they like what they see, is they'll print off the submission and read it, like you said, on a hard copy. Because what they like to do is they like to have margins around the outside so they can write notes. What you like, though, Alexa, if you remember rightly, when you're reading on screen, what typeface do you like? Arial, which is a sans serif font.
And
you're
calibri.
Reading it on, because you're reading it on screen. So you've proved my point.
Yes.
When you're reading on screen, you like a sans serif typeface.
Yes.
When you're reading a hard copy, as in print, you'll want a serif typeface.
Yes. You see, gold here, everyone. Gold.
So unless you're writing a book targeted at dyslexic readers, you'll want your body copy to be in a serif style typeface. This is much easier to read. And I've read books that try and be clever by using Calibri, for example. And I couldn't, when I read a book, it must have been 10 years ago, I read this book and I couldn't understand why I found it difficult to read. And then I realized it was set in a sans serif typeface. It's why newspapers also haven't changed their typeface in the last 100 years. If you think about it, all newspapers are set, I think, in Times New Roman. So don't fix what isn't broken. And don't try and be clever. I hate clever authors who try and use a typeface that's never been seen before. Like, aren't I clever? It actually just makes it harder. So don't do it. What I like to do, though, is to add contrast to my book design. So if your body copy is a serif typeface, which is what I'd recommend, then the headings and the subheadings can look really good in a sans serif typeface. Adding contrast helps the reader identify the differences between the sections. If you have your headings in the same typeface as the body copy, then it all can begin to look a bit dull. And you don't want your book to be dull. You want to entice the reader. And one of the ways of doing that is clever design and using contrast. So heading versus body copy. This is one of the common ways of contrasting your text.
Yes. Now, not on books that we've worked on together because you already do this, but I have occasionally had proofs to go through where the headings, the subheadings, the main text, they're all in the same typeface. And I've marked up the headings to be changed, to be in a different typeface, because as you say, otherwise a page can look really uninviting. And as the reader, you might not be conscious of the fact that the main text is in a serif font and the headings are sans serif, but your eye and your brain will be so much happier and more comfortable with the way it looks, and you'll be more likely to want to read on.
Exactly. And if you can imagine a book, especially if it's a business style book, no doubt, sometimes the text can be very dry. I've just done a book for a repeat customer called Development Aid, and it's all about foreign aid to countries. I mean, you could say that's quite a dry subject. But what I've tried to do is I've tried to make the headings look, because otherwise it would just be reams and reams and reams of text. And when you do that, you're then helping the reader. And that's what's really important. So when you're talking design, make sure they have a good understanding of how they can make your book look interesting, especially if it's a subject that's, I don't want to say boring, but just quite dry.
Yes, yes.
I don't know if you remember the rule I stated in the last episode about knowing who your target audience is and then matching your typeface to that audience. The same goes for your body copy as well. There are some, now I really don't want to get into the whole feminism, going down the whole bunching people into one group. I'm going to use the word masculine and feminine here, and I hope I'm not offending any listeners. I'm 50. I'm maybe not woke, but whatever. So now, there are some typefaces that are just more masculine. Please, I do not mean to offend anyone that's listening, than others. And there are some that are more feminine. I mean, I can't put it in any other way. Swirly script type font appeals to women, whereas bold, heavy, very dark black typeset tends to be favored by male readers. It's just one of those things. So I always try and match the typeface depending on who's obviously going to be reading the book. Having a conversation with your designer will also help with that choice. But just remember the golden rule. Use a serif typeface with your body copy, unless you're writing a book specifically for dyslexic readers, and use a sans serif for your heading and subheadings. Now, there is other ways that you can add pizzazz or readability to your book, and that's by having distinct elements within your design. So, for instance, if you have lots of quotes within your book, which a lot of people do like to have, then you can make a feature of these. I like to block them and pull them out from the text and have them designed differently. So there's space above and below, and they're in a big block of usually italic. Now, remember, you need to make sure that the font style of the typeface is one that you like. There are quite a few typefaces out there that are lovely, but then you look at the italic font and it's just not nice. It's unreadable sometimes. So it's important for you to like all the styles the typeface comes in. This actually happened once where the author loved the body typeface but hated the italic font. So I had to substitute it with a different one. Now, when you use programs like InDesign, this is actually quite easy, as you just assign a paragraph style or a character style, and then it changes everywhere that it appears for you. Obviously, if you're using Word, that's not quite the same thing. The same goes for the bold version of the typeface. Does it even have one? I did a project once where the author needed to have bolded text. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a side tangent here. Don't use too much bolded text. Otherwise, it can look really amateurish. And if you've got lots of it, of italics and bolding of words, the reader will become blind and the opposite will happen. Anyway, got a bit off topic. So make sure that the bolded text that you've chosen looks good. I had someone who didn't have a bold font in their typeface, so I actually had to manipulate the program to do that and it's called by adding a stroke. It looked okay, but the problem with adding a stroke to a typeface that doesn't have a specific bold font is the spacing then goes all out of whack. So you do need to make sure that the typeface you choose has the various fonts that you want.
Yeah, because if the spacing goes, then that can make it very hard proofreading the designed proofs.
Yeah.
Because it's up to the proofreader to pick up where the spacing is wrong.
Exactly. So I mean, I can manipulate a typeface that doesn't have a bold font, but it's not something I'd recommend. And I'd always ask the author to go back and choose a typeface that has a bold font so that I'm not having to manually add it. Another good design trick is to use box out, or Johnson boxes as they're called in the design industry. Johnson boxes are where you have a literal box that is usually outlined and shaded in a different color, and then you have blocks of text within it. I usually use this style when someone is relating to a case study or telling the reader a true story, say they've gone off a slight tangent. It differentiates the story very clearly from the rest of the book. You can even change the typeface within it so that it stands out even more. Call to action boxes can also be designed to make sure they grab the reader's attention. Now, a call to action box is something that business owners use when they're writing a book to get the person to then go onto a website to find out more information. I actually like to break my own rules here. For short bursts of text, I would then actually use a sans serif type typeface for the call outs, because it really is such a different typeface. It makes the reader pay attention. But the call out boxes are generally only 2 or 3 lines. So add call to actions in your business books, because this is where you're going to make your return on investment, but make sure they're designed in such a way that they really grab the reader's attention.
I love Johnson, but I did Johnson boxes. I didn't know that's what they were called, but I love them. And I think with a non-fiction book, as you were saying, a little while ago, for me, the more interesting it looks, the better, because you've not got a sort of driving murder plot to keep you reading. So you want the page to look inviting, and the text can really benefit from being broken up on the page. And if you've got coloured boxes, so a kind of theme for, say, there's boxes on different topics, and there's a colour following that, the theme of each topic through, that can really help as well. And it just makes the book more inviting. So a really good design will help to keep your reader engaged. And pull quotes and boxes are also a great way to help you as a writer to emphasize particular points that you want to get across to your reader.
Yeah, I mean, the book that we did for Lucille, she did a black and white version of her book, and she did a color version of her book. And I have to say, the design that I did for her, she used all of these elements and they looked amazing. And especially on the color version, she had her call outs she had a blue shading behind it. And it just looked really, really inviting, really good.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure. Now, for children's books, you can obviously use a variety of typefaces within your book, but be careful with this. Having too many can make it harder to read. I was just having this conversation with one of our authors today, Jodie, who I'm just getting her second book done now, When Wally Gets Angry. And she was asking for some of her text to be set out in swirly fashion, like sort of in a different shape. Now, for some books, I would say this is great, but because her book is a rhyming book, if you've suddenly got your words that are all different shapes and swirlies, it's actually going to make it harder for the reader to read. So I would avoid it, because otherwise the rhyme might be harder to flow, because the reader is more distracted with where the shape of the book is going. Look at the style of book and decide from there whether or not you're going to have different typefaces throughout your book. Now, actually, what I've decided to do with Jodie is some of the words that she's used, like angry and stomp and frustrated, I've actually used a different typeface, but it's subtle so that you can pull out those specific words. If you look at Julia Donaldson, for instance, her books are all about the pictures and not about the text being all swirly and fluttery around the page.
There's also, I think, sometimes in some children's books I've seen, if the words big and small, if that's a theme through the book, the small might be in a smaller typeface and the big in a bigger. So every time those words, they stand out because of the size is reflecting what the word means.
Yeah. And I would definitely agree with that. I mean, in fact, with Jodie's book, like I said, whenever the character is saying stomp or angry, I've put it in a bolder typeface just so that it sort of emphasizes then that particular word. And it's looking really good. I'm really pleased with it. But I haven't manipulated the shapes of the word. So, for instance, she's got a line about a roller coaster. And I think what she wanted me to do was put roller coaster in a roller coastery type style.
Yeah.
And I just think it would be harder for the reader to read. So I've told her no.
Yeah. Because it's also for a very early reader, so 5-6-year-old, that's a big word to recognize anyway. So yeah.
Now, covers. Haven't really spoken about covers. I spoke last week, I believe, about typefaces to use on the cover. And I'm just going to reiterate the fact that I like a really clean, clear typeface on the title. And I like to stay away from typefaces that are in fashion. In fact, I mentioned this in my masterclass that I held on my Facebook group yesterday. Only a few years ago, everyone was using the handwritten style curly typeface. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I think I do. Yes, I've got a picture in my head. So yeah.
It was being used a lot by people who were writing self-help books. And they use this typeface that is sort of this very artistic, very pretty looking swirly font, which I think looks great on postcards, affirmation postcards. I think they look great. But on a book title, I kind of debate that, because actually now I'm not seeing that typeface being used very much. It's sort of going out of fashion. So very quickly, you're going to date your book if you use an in-fashion typeface.
And as an add-on to that, I think staying away from anything that can specifically date your book in the content too is a good idea for the longevity of your product. I know writers can reference all sorts of things, and in historical fiction, obviously it's completely appropriate, but I do think it's worth being cautious in how and what you use. You need to be mindful of your audience, which is something I know we keep saying. Well, while Mr. Blobby, for example, was a big thing back in the 80s and 90s, to suddenly start talking about him in a book aimed at 6-year-olds today will potentially just leave them going, well, who?
Exactly.
So anything that can date your book kind of inappropriately is best to steer clear of.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I'm just not really a fan of those type of typefaces anyway. So I would say go with a contemporary typeface for your cover, something that's going to last. There's nothing wrong with a classic typeface. In fact, the development aid book that I was telling you about, I've used a very classic typeface for the front, and it's just one that fits the reader. I mean, people that are going to be reading about development aid are going to be of a certain age, and it's just clear and clean to see, and I really like it. It appeals to me. This is who the book is basically aimed at, someone that doesn't know an awful lot about development aid. I'll put a link in the show notes in case anyone's interested. And I mean, I've designed a book that I would like to pick up, but also I know that perhaps my partner would like to pick up to appeal to both women and men, which sometimes is quite hard. But I think it looks really good and it looks really classic.
Oh, yeah, that's lovely.
And it's a very, very interesting book. But anyway, I go off topic.
Yeah. So Alexa too has just held that up for me to see. That's why I'm going, oh, that's lovely. Because I can see it, but
Obviously
sorry,
the readers
you
can't.
Yes.
I'll put a link in the book in case anyone is interested in learning more about development aid. It's a fascinating subject. Anyway, so stay away from in-fashion typefaces. Now, the back cover, I tend to stick with something that's really easy to read. So obviously a serif style typeface for the description, set in a clear, fully justified box or centrally aligned, one of the two. Kids' books tend to be centrally aligned. Adult fiction for the synopsis tends to be in a box, justified. Don't, whatever you do less justified, because it just looks awful. And I like to have an author box usually on the back of the book. And funnily enough, I'm going to hold the book up again for Alexa to see. There's the author box. I'll put a picture of this actually in the show notes so you can see. But interestingly, the author box, I have actually the text that I've used for about the author is in a sans serif font. And that's so that it's very distinguishable between the description of the book and then who's written it. So you can mix and match. You just need to know what you're doing. So a quick reminder of the do's and don'ts, as I've just given you a whistle-stop tour of typefaces in terms of contrast and the differences between serif and sans serif. Try and use a serif typeface for the body copy unless it's a specific book for a certain reader. Use a contrasting heading typeface. Stick with the known formula. And that's it. Now, next week, we'll be talking about the pet peeves of bad design. It's going to be a goodie because I've got quite a few. And if you know what these are, it's just kind of lazy typesetting. And then when I explain what these are, you'll probably start seeing them in books that you read because they're more common than not.
But yeah, there'll be something else I find with my job when I'm reading a book. I'm constantly thinking, oh, would I have done it like that? But that'll be something else I'll be looking out for then. But anyway, thank you for really opening our eyes to this kind of nitty gritty of what book design should be about, because like I think I said at the beginning of the series, I don't know anything about this side. I do my job and then I pass it over. And it's so interesting to hear everything that actually has to be thought about and the detail of it that you need to go into, and probably the toing and froing with the author in choosing what the book is ultimately going to look like. So so it's really
it's a big part that I think people don't kind of realize. And it's quite interesting. I mean, especially for children's books, it's really important to get that right because it sets the whole theme up for the book. So, yeah. So that's it.
No plonking.
No plonking.
No plonking.
And no just, oh, that'll do. It's got to be Anyway, so that's it for this week's episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. Do please give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Our details are on the show notes, so do get in touch. We'd love to know what you're thinking so far of this series. And that's everything from me.
And from me. So see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.